Danny, we're back again.
We're back again to talk about Rick's bread and butter topic, Theranostics.
Yes.
Maybe not bread and butter, but it is a fun topic.
Let me just find my knife here, and I can maybe figure out a way to put butter on the bread. But sure, yes, exactly. This is my topic. Um, yeah. So we've touched about it before. I think we had an episode years ago. That's weird to say years ago, but we did have an episode years ago about Theranostics. There's been some that's been the same and things that have also changed a little bit. So I think it's a good time we update everyone on some of what we have going on here at Cancer Specialists in North Florida.
Yeah, I think it started more with our neuroendocrine, tumor treatment and then kind of branched out from there. And in our research department, we've had a lot of interest getting trials open with new therapies, new theranostic therapies that we can hopefully offer to patients in a clinical trial setting. Um, I think Lutathera was our first theranostic, capability here at CSNF, correct? As far as
Uh,
treatment goes.
well, I think actually Xofigo was.
Oh, Zofigo. Yeah, I
Yeah,
always forget
so
about Zofigo,
yeah, so
but you're right.
Xofigo definitely was one of the earlier ones.
Yeah.
That's a drug that's given for patients with prostate cancer that's metastasized to the bones. It's an alpha emitter, so it's a different type of emitter than lutetium, but it's specific for prostate cancer, really specific for prostate cancer in the bones. So it works very well in that scenario. The only downside is it doesn't treat cancer spots that are outside the bones. So it's a very specific indication, but that led into, as you mentioned, Danny, lutetium dotatate, or sometimes Lutathera, I think is how they brand it, which is a beta emitter, which is lutetium, linked to a protein that's specific for neuroendocrine tumors and also found in some meningiomas. But the indication for treatment is for metastatic neuroendocrine tumors. It used to be when this first came out was in the second line setting, but now is actually approved as well in the frontline setting and approved. Surprisingly, I was seeing last year in pediatric patients
Hmm.
with metastatic neuroendocrine tumors. So I think the indication with as it is in your world sometimes with drugs, the indications keep expanding and moving
Hmm.
earlier in lines of therapy.
Have we treated any meningiomas at CSNF?
No, I mean, typically it's more on the diagnostic realm with if you listen to our last episode, the dotatate PET scan
Hmm.
can be used to help diagnose and monitor progression of atypical meningiomas. But I think there are studies looking at it in treatment of atypical meningiomas, but at least I'm not aware of it being, approved for mainline use yet.
Right. Okay.
But lutetium, like I said, it's a beta emitter used to treat neuroendocrine tumors. It is a process where a patient would get an infusion once every 2 months for 4 total doses. So it's an 8-month course of therapy. Similar to a PET scan, you are radioactive when you receive the drug. So there's some practical considerations related to it after treatment. For the first few days after treatment, people don't have to be in strict isolation, but it's a pretty, a lot of recommendations around, separate bathrooms, separate beds, washing your hands frequently, that type of thing, when possible, because you are actually emitting the drug through your sweat, you're emitting the drug through your urine and stool. So it's kind of unique in that aspect, in that there's some kind of, radiation precautions related to it.
Now, for our audience, Rick, and a little bit for me, what do you think, how do you explain the difference between these radiopharmaceuticals, some being alpha emitters, some being beta emitters? Is it better to be an alpha versus a beta emitter? If patient asks you, what does that mean? How do you explain that to them?
Yeah, so it's basically the particles, well, a couple things. One is it's the sort of the rate of decay, so the rate at which radiation's being thrown off. It's the energy of the radiation that's being thrown off, and it's the depth at which the radiation can penetrate. So, there's different types of beta emitters, there's different types of alpha emitters, but in general, the beta emitters are a little bit, I think, easier. And again, this is speaking as a not involved in the manufacturing of these drugs, but my understanding is it's a little bit easier to make beta emitters. So a lot of these drugs, and there's been other drugs in the past that aren't really used anymore for like lymphoma and things that are linked to beta emitters that, that's kind of where these things start. So usually these companies will come up with a beta emitter, and
Hmm.
then eventually, if they're able to figure out a way to make an alpha emitter with the same target, um, do that, because in general, at least the way we learn it is alpha emitters can do a little bit more direct damage, and they have a little bit less of a spillover to non-target tissues. So I think in a perfect world, apples for apples, an alpha emitter is probably going to be a little bit better. But in reality, though, there just aren't that many alpha emitters, because I think the cost in the manufacturing process is more challenging.
I see. Yeah, I think I remember learning about those lymphoma drugs that I think were used for some low-grade lymphomas, if I'm not mistaken. But we don't use them much anymore, obviously, because I haven't used them and or referred patients for them.
Yeah, I think I think they were a lot of promise, but then I think as the chemos got better and
Hmm.
things like that, and you guys had, more targeted agents as well for lymphomas,
Right.
I think it kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah, and so the product we have available for prostate cancer also is a lutetium product, and
Yeah,
then
so
linked to PSMA or
yeah,
binding
so
to
basically,
PSMA.
exactly. It's the same actual radioisotope as dotatate, lutetium, and that's linked to PSMA. The brand name is Pluvicto. So a lot of patients have heard of that. A lot of people now, I think, have heard of that. Pharma definitely has. There's been big advertising campaigns around it. So, this is the of course, there are many, 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 many magnitudes more patients with prostate cancer than neuroendocrine tumors. So I think it's the one people mostly know, because it's obviously much more prevalent.
Hmm.
Um, Similar to the dotatate, you are radioactive when you receive it. So it's a lot of similar precautions. The half-life is very similar because it's the same radio tracer.
Yeah.
Um, but the biggest difference right now is the standard schedule is 6 doses given every 6 weeks. So slightly different dosing schedule. These infusions are also a little bit faster than the lutetium because we don't have to give it with amino acids like we do with dotatate, because there's some kidney uptake with the dotatate. So we give amino acids to help protect the kidneys. So we don't have to worry about that with Pluvicto. So the logistics of it in terms of the day of infusion is actually very fast. Patients are usually in and out the door in an hour, and the infusion only takes about a minute. So it's pretty timely
Hmm.
treatment. But yeah, that's where I think the biggest change has been, probably since we recorded our last episode about this, is it's now in the commercial setting, in patients who have failed chemotherapy. It's a great option. It's moving up in different lines of therapy. I know it was just approved for now patients who haven't even seen chemo, but maybe
Right.
the medical oncology team or the radiation oncology team feels they're not good chemotherapy candidates. Now we can consider it. It's been FDA approved for that. I think the insurance side is going to take a little bit longer to catch up, but I think that'll be there in the future. And then on the clinical trial side, I think people have seen the the effectiveness of the drug, as well as the fact that it's got such a broad indication and prostate cancer is such a huge market. I think there's a ton of other companies trying to come up with their own radiopharmaceuticals, including alpha emitters for prostate cancer, um, linked to using PSMA as the backbone. So it's a very fun time to be in, because I feel like we're getting fielded clinical trial opportunities on a monthly basis.
Hmm. Yeah, I think So what do you tell patients about the cost of Pluvicto per dose if insurance was not paying for it?
Yeah, it's pretty much, I mean, for at least anyone I know, not an affordable treatment. It's, the dose, just the dose itself is in the order of, 50 to $60,000 per dose. So times six
Right.
doses is, you're looking at probably upwards close to $400,000 by the time you factor in all the other charges. So, I mean, it really is something that, paying out of pocket. I mean, yeah, I don't know anyone that can afford that, but
Right.
I guess in theory someone could, but it's certainly something that we have a big team here at CSNF that really makes sure that patients have the right insurance, their insurance is going to do the right thing. We have all our ducks in a row on the documentation side, so that way the patients aren't stuck getting an unexpected bill that if you get a bill like that, obviously for most people is gonna, it's just
Yeah,
gonna ruin their lives. So we
correct.
really try to be, um, on the ball with making sure that's not the case.
Yeah, I think the exciting part of it is how much research is being done right now, because as you can imagine, you get some success in one area, whether that's prostate cancer, neuroendocrine tumors, which are not quite as common, but the success with Pluvicto kind of has translated into all this research, and not only in prostate cancer, but in other cancers, using similar lutetium, and I'm sure there's other and I think there's other alpha emitters and things that are out there being studied. So it's just a good time to, potentially even entertain getting on a clinical trial. I know we had a upfront Pluvicto clinical trial that we enrolled patients into, and that was patients with newly diagnosed stage 4 prostate cancer who um, were treatment naive, and it was upfront Pluvicto treatment with hormone deprivation or androgen deprivation therapy. So, there's trials like that you can be put on to some of these new drugs, and I think anecdotally we had some good responses with it too. So always a good idea to consider research in these settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's pretty clear it's just going to keep moving earlier and earlier in, um, the treatment line. So I think that, the studies we get to be a part of because we were part of them, I think we get a lot of opportunities to do that here. I think, Novartis specifically speaking of Pluvicto has worked with us before on a couple clinical trials, and we have one enrolling now. And I know we're looking at opening several more. So I think it's definitely an area of, you know, uh, I think a benefit to our patients.
Two questions for you, Rick. If a patient asks about their risk of a secondary cancer malignancy after getting treatment with one of these lutetium products, what do you tell them? And the second question is, what is the risk to family members, friends who might have accidentally been exposed to patients during their treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I would the second question first. So it would depend on the what the exposure was. If you were, ingesting somehow the byproduct. I mean, certainly, yeah, you're basically receiving partial dose of what the patient received. If you were just
Hmm.
in the same room as them and sat on the couch next to them for an hour, probably no real risk. So I think it just kind of
Hmm.
depends on what the actual exposure was.
Right.
In terms of your first question, basically, if you look at the data, it's kind of the similar risks as with most chemotherapies, in
Hmm.
terms of causing a secondary cancer. So it's not going to be a solid cancer. Typically, it'll be a bone marrow issue, something like a leukemia, but more commonly like an MDS or a myelodysplastic syndrome. And thankfully, those rates are low. You're talking, 1%, 2% type risk, but it is certainly a real risk and certainly something we tell patients. The latency time for that I think is fairly variable. I don't know what you tell patients on, chemo secondary malignancies, but
Yeah.
what I remember is, kind of in that 5 to 10 year range from therapy. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but yeah,
Yeah.
I think Pluvicto falls in that similar category.
I agree with that. I think it'd be interesting to see if there's any, and I don't know off the top of my head, but if there's any data just doing blood testing to screen for clonal hematopoiesis. And what that means is just looking to see if patients have some underlying mutations in their blood cells at baseline before these therapies that may increase the rate of myelodysplastic syndrome or leukemia. Again, for the audience, I'm not sure if there's much data to show that patients with mutations preceding their treatment are at higher risk. I would hypothesize maybe that they would be, given that there's a mutation already there. But again, these patients, especially in the prostate cancer setting, where the initial indication was for Pluvicto, we're talking patients with life expectancies of maybe a year or two, and they're not going to really live long enough, unfortunately, to even, see a side effect like MDS or leukemia. But as we move the treatment up sooner, and a patient's life expectancy might be 5 to 7 years, then you worry about it a little bit more.
Or a neuroendocrine tumor, which can hang out for decades.
Right.
So yeah, no, it's a real risk, and I think it's definitely something that has to be factored in the equation when a patient makes a decision on what they want to do.
I was just thinking, and maybe this is a better question for when we have Dr. Ayad on to talk bispecific. Do you guys foresee any time in the future of, these new therapies, theranostics, bispecifics, even just immunotherapy kind of taking the place totally of chemotherapy? Or do you think chemotherapy is always going to be kind of a necessary evil?
Depends on the disease. I think, there are some, like, for example, high grade lymphomas, whether it's a B cell, T cell lymphoma that's high grade. When I say high grade, I mean that it's aggressive. Its proliferation rate is very high. Tumors can double within a month, that kind of a quick growing cancer. We know that chemotherapy is very, very effective for those cancers. And in some cases, cures two-thirds or more of patients. So when you have a curative therapy, you certainly want to show that the bispecific therapy has just as high of cure rates, if not more, obviously, just to, spare toxicity. I do think overall the bispecific therapies and Theranostics, Pluvicto, the lutetium products have better tolerability than chemotherapy or multi-agent chemotherapy. So I do think in some diseases that they will surpass using chemotherapy, but there's going to be a lot of trials before it becomes ubiquitous that we're using these in place of chemo.
And then second question, and this is, I feel like something that gets talked about a lot with the advancements in radiation, like traditional beam therapy, where it's so precise now that you're not having a lot of damage to external tissue or surrounding tissue rather. I guess with the radiopharmaceutical, kind of what's the difference there? Like, or is there going to be more, or is it just so targeted that it kind of,
But
I'm not
um,
asking that well.
no, I mean, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, the main difference is the indication. So, like, for example, with radiation, external beam radiation with a machine, we're targeting an area or one tumor or a localized spot. When you're talking about a drug therapy like Pluvicto or dotatate or chemo, you're trying to treat the cancer's kind of, in most cases, not in one area. It's in multiple areas of the body. So you need something a little bit that addresses it more. So just by that nature, these infusional drugs are going to have more radiation to normal tissue just because it's hitting more areas of the body, is one way to look at it.
Gotcha.
There's a difference between some of the different particles. Like I said, alpha particles that come out of the nucleus in general are going to have less um, yeah, scatter, if you will, or less sort of standby effects of radiation, but there is still some. So it's targeted at the cellular level. You're talking, I think it's in the order of like micrometers distance. So we're not talking, inches or centimeters. It's teeny tiny distances, but obviously, you know, a little bit sometimes can cause a problem. So I think it's just a different it's a different problem in terms of radiation versus a machine radiation. What we worry about is less radiation around where we're treating, because a lot of times that radiation is going to be on a radiation magnitude exponentially more potentially damaging. So I think it's just magnitudes and surface area of treatment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Those are my only two questions.
And I think definitely we have to stress that catching cancer early is of utmost importance. So a lot of the advances that we're going to have in the future and statistically becoming better at curing all types of cancer are going to be based on catching cancer earlier. And that's the ones that we tend to have a difficult time finding early. I think that's where we're going to see the biggest bang for our buck. Finding a pancreatic cancer when it's a millimeter or two, or, finding, another type of difficult to treat cancer earlier so that we can just surgically excise, radiate in certain cases, and then the patient's cured. We don't have to use these expensive therapies.
And that comes with regular doctor's appointments and making sure if something seems off that you're visiting your doctor and not trusting Dr. Google, as Rick likes to say.
Well, I mean, it's just cancer's the worst, right? I mean, it's just the worst. So it's like even you could be completely asymptomatic and no problems and have something in you that is a disaster, and there's no test that's going to pick it up. And then sometimes there may have been a test that could have picked it up, or, so I think there's going to be some things that I think are going to be, to Danny's point, we hope we get to the place where we could be able to do a blood test or a scan or something where you would be able to say, oh yeah, watch here, this is going to be a problem. But I think unfortunately, that reality is, in my opinion, at least, a lot of these things you read about and hear about are more on the hype train than they are on the reality train in terms of what will actually translate to difference. But I will try to be as optimistic as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, adhering to screening guidelines right now, which is kind of,
right.
Also what Rick is saying. It's like, if you know, based on family history, based on genetic, predisposition, based on something that, you need to be screened more often, or just following the normal screening guidelines. I mean, a lot of cancers can be caught earlier if you just follow guidelines and talk to your primary care, talk to us, and we're happy to go over that with them. All right. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Rick and Danny Show. Rick, I loved your explanations about Theranostics. You're a true expert in the field.
I've never heard you be nice to me like this. I'll take it. So
he's really buttering you up.
I felt bad about my golf comment.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'll remember that the next time I'm beating you. It's cool. It's cool. Cool.
It always goes back and forth.
Well, that's why I think that's why golf is so addicting, is because, at least for me at my skill level, I don't know what I'm going to get every time I go out there. So, but no. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We appreciate your support.